We're going to share with you some really important tips and some of the most common mistakes, things that you might want to do, things that you may not want to do in regards to layoffs and severance agreements.
All right. Let's go ahead and take it away, Summer.
Sure thing. So I think it's a tough topic because nobody likes to think about having to let somebody go from their job, especially when it's a layoff situation. Because, let's face it, if somebody's violated a policy, then, it's a pretty clear path that, it would result in them no longer having a job. But when it's a layoff, these workers, they haven't done anything wrong. And so it is a very difficult and emotional time. And I would say from the employer standpoint, when these types of events happen, to not underestimate the impact of the individuals who are left even after this change, because I think there's so much focus on those that are leaving, that there's not as much attention of like that effect of those that remain, their concerns, and how stressful that can be as well. From a like HR process standpoint, we often work with something called a severance agreement. So, Joey, I'm sure you've worked with a ton of severance agreements over the years. And do you want to share with our listeners kind of the essence of what they are and why they exist?
Sure. I'll try to keep it down the middle because on one hand, well, let's just go for all of it, right? Sometimes severance agreements are utilized as like hush agreements. So if you let someone go, part of the clauses in there will be you can't say bad things about the business, you waive your right to sue, so on and so forth. Some of which is actually changing in the legal landscape. So there are clauses that people may include in a severance agreement that are being challenged and not being upheld in courts. So forget that I went down that rabbit trail. But anyway, severance agreements are a tool that you utilize when conducting a termination that will summarize how much a person is going to receive from a financial standpoint upon termination, what the terms of the termination were. It might also include a refresher on any confidentiality agreements that have been signed, or non-disparagement, or anything of that nature from a legalese standpoint. And typically, in a severance agreement, you will get the recipient will have 7 days to sign it legally in most cases, and then there's a period in which a person's able to change their mind. Here in Maryland, it's 21 days, but it could be different in your jurisdiction. So the severance agreement is the contract that both parties sign at the end of separation, and usually it is if a person is being fired, but you can also utilize it if a person is voluntarily leaving on their own terms.
Yeah, great summary, Joey. And I wanted to talk about some of the like most common mistakes that I see when we begin working with companies and they share their severance agreement or their severance pay practice or policy if they have a formal policy written. And kind of the first thing is, let's say they're looking to part ways with a team member and they want to pay them for the next 2 weeks and then, just be done. So that's definitely one way that you can approach it. But my recommendation is like, why would we give away pay for free? And the reason I say that is because a more beneficial approach to the employer would be still give that money as an offer to that parting team member as severance pay. But in exchange, you're asking them to sign the severance agreement, which says they're waiving their right to sue you for a wide variety of potential lawsuits, right? That non disparagement that you mentioned. and provides the company with not a watertight protection, but a lot more protections than had they not done it. So again, it's like, well, why would you just give that money away for free? And then kind of almost the same kind of a related mistake that I see is they give the severance agreement and pay the money on the final paycheck, which is not compliant with, in many cases, with kind of the process of needing to get the severance agreement signed and some of the timeframes that uh, in some states are required. So, for example, there is something called the older workers protection. And essentially, what this means is that if you are 40 or older, you are afforded additional protections. And how this applies to the severance agreement is because you would essentially be waiving some potential rights to sue for potential violations of the law related to being an older worker. So all this really boils down to is that in some states, those older workers, 40 and over, they actually have a 21-day decision period. So they have 21 days to consult with a lawyer if they choose to, look through the severance agreement, fully think through what they are waiving, as opposed to an individual who is under 40, typically is provided 7 days. And, I've seen some companies offer 14 and even some offer 21. So I think, there's kind of a different mindset as to whether they want to offer more, but certainly offering less is can be a problem because it's essentially saying like you're not giving this employee a fair chance to consult legal counsel and really think through their legal rights that they're waiving.
Yeah, and there's so much about this is why we say, when doing effective HR, you can't trust your gut or Google, because there's so much about just like that feeling of, hey, I want to wrap this up as soon as possible. Let's get the person the letter, let's get them to sign it, pay out the money, be done with it, move on.
Mhm.
But to your point, you have to leave room for the legally allowed timeframes to take their course. So, like you said, the 40, if you're 40 and over, you get 21 days. That's not typically how I hear business leaders think about severance. They want something done and completed up and through the last paycheck, or not the last paycheck, sorry, but the next pay cycle, so that they can get that person off the books as soon as they can. But it takes a little bit more nuance than that. Um, and then another thing that I see folks get wrong on severance agreements is basically just like finding a template online and not. There's nothing wrong with finding a template online. There's everything wrong with finding the template, using it, and not reading what it's for. Right. So I've seen severance templates that are applicable in Canada. I've seen severance templates that, maybe the business is in New York, but the template is for a company in Texas. So you have to be very, very careful if you're doing DIY HR to um, pay attention to the terms and agreements that you are subjecting yourself to upholding, and they may not be the ones that you want to subject yourself to.
Oh my gosh, Joey, you said DIY HR, and suddenly I had visions of like a really bad reality show, like
We see
that.
that reality show.
Oh man, oh man. But it's true. And, I think we touched on it a little bit, but I want to reinforce that message that one size does not fit all. And in many cases, some of the details in these agreements do vary from state to state. So I think the takeaway here is that if you do have a template, even if it's been reviewed by legal, to ensure that there is a second look, if you've hired in a new state, that the language is appropriate for that state because they do vary widely. And you don't want to find yourself in a position where you believe that you have the protections of some sort of lawsuit in a severance agreement, only to find out that you don't because you didn't have the appropriate language in there. So that could be really problematic. And talking about like the reduction in force and or severance process as a whole, one of the other most common mistakes that I see is in regards to COBRA continuation. And so for those that aren't super familiar with that term, COBRA is the program that allows employees to continue their employer sponsored health plans after they've left the company at their own cost. So sometimes companies will say, we want to take care of this employee and pay for their COBRA for whatever amount of time. That's all fine and great. However, it's super important that there is that, I call it the line in the sand. Like you need to break away from this employee, like as clean as possible, um, just to ensure that like everybody is being treated the same. And what I mean by that is what you don't want to do is just say, hey, Joey, we'll continue your COBRA. You're good for the next year. You don't need to do anything, because that's not the appropriate way to handle it. While he still may have coverage or he still may have coverage, um, the correct way to do it would actually be to have a written agreement of how much would be paid and for what period of time. And then after that employee has left the company, they still have to go through the action of electing COBRA, filling out the forms, sending them in, actually making the payment. And then they send a copy of their receipt back to the company for reimbursement.
Yeah, yeah. The process documentation is so key, especially we're talking about risks. So we're talking about doing this at scale. And another thing that I think about at scale is the idea of trying to churn out all of this paperwork and the, the the errors and the human error that might come along with putting in wrong data for the wrong person, and then on top of the agony of going through losing your job, you then have to go back to HR and say, hey, this document isn't right. Please give me the right documentation. So, we might know a company that helps with processing these things, aims to get the data right. But again, if you're doing it yourself, or maybe you're listening and you have an HR department, just double check, triple check the accuracy of the data that is going out in employee communications, because once it's out there, it's harder to pull back or make adjustments without it being agonizing.
Yep, RIFs are hard. They're hard
Yeah.
for those impacted for sure. They're hard for those that are left behind at the company, and they're hard for everybody involved with making these difficult decisions. And I would say the thing that I learned very early on in regards to this in the HR space is just to ensure that even in these difficult situations, individuals will respond differently to this type of news. But just to ensure that everybody is treated with the utmost like dignity and respect, regardless of their response, is, I think one of the most important things that we can do in these situations.